It's a little bit later than I normally do. I've got Brian Farmer who said, well, he would be here, except he's gone to fetch his coffee just as he came to, he's here, just as he came to 8:30. Well done, Brian. A little bit of background why I'm doing a late one with Brian. Brian's an old mate of mine from school. I mean, clearly he hasn't had as tough a life as I has because he's worn a lot better. And Brian comes from my little town in Biddulph. He's always been a celeb in my mind because his brother used to play for Stoke City. But what's happened is he's had an interesting few years as press association reporter, a journalist, well, I guess the reason we're here to talk is a couple of things. It's 20 years since the terrible events in Soham, which Brian was I guess involved afterwards with, and he's going to tell us about that. There is a TV show actually coming out next Monday, the 10th, 11th, and 12th. I've written it down at the bottom, which dramatizes the show. Actually, I think Brian is the first person from Biddulph who's had someone on TV playing them. But I want to just go through with Brian. He's been very kind to come along and tell us about this. And he's wanted on a lot of TV shows at the moment. So we're lucky to just sneak half an hour or so with him. Look at him, he said, his face. And Brian, just tell us a little bit about what you do, and we'll get on. I'd like you to just explain to us what you saw on this day that led to you being instrumental in Ian Huntley's apprehension, and what I'm particularly interested in is mindsets, questioning strategies, and what goes on in a journalist's mind in these events. Brian, start talking, mate.
Okay, well, good evening, and thanks very much for having me. So I'm a reporter, just a third-rate hack. I've been a reporter for 40 years. I started off on a weekly paper and worked in regional papers, but for the last 30-odd years, I've been a reporter with the Press Association. I don't know if people know what that is. The Press Association is Britain's national news agency. It provides 24 hours a day news stories to the rest of the media. So in 2002, when Holly and Jessica went missing and was murdered, I was the Press Association's regional reporter in the Eastern Counties, and I lived in Cambridge. So it was a job that I covered. So and I was the first person, not through any particular skill, just by a fluke really. I was the first person to interview Ian Huntley and Maxine Carr. So what happened was that the girls went missing on Sunday, August the 4th, 2002. And on the following Thursday, the police issued a timeline of sightings. They said that people around Soham have seen these girls after you probably remember they were at a barbecue and then went for a walk in their Manchester United shirts and weren't seen again. And they issued a timeline of people who'd seen them. Someone in the leisure centre had seen them where they'd stopped to buy some crisps and that kind of thing, or people who thought to have seen them. So the most obvious exciting sighting at that time was that there'd been a sighting at a petrol station on the edge of Soham, where a petrol station attendant had said he'd seen two girls matching their description in the back of a car with a man. It turned out it wasn't Holly and Jessica, but it seemed the most dramatic sighting at the moment. So most of the journalists there went off to that sighting, and one of my colleagues went off to do that. But one of the sightings was the police said that the caretaker of Soham Village College, which was the neighbouring school to where the girls went to, they went to the junior school in Soham. They said the caretaker had seen them outside his house, and he at that stage was thought to be the last person to see them. So I decided that the first thing I would do was go and knock on the caretaker's door for two reasons, really. My logic would, sadly, I've covered quite a lot of cases where children and people have gone missing and been murdered. My logic is that, first of all, it's likely to be the person who's responsible for whatever happened to Holly and Jessica is likely to be someone local. It's someone they know. It's not some wandering monster who's arrived from outer space. And it's probably a man. So the last man to see them is probably the first person to go and speak to, and that's what we seem to know. So I didn't know anything about Ian Huntley. I didn't know his name was Ian Huntley. I don't recall seeing him before. I had no idea that Maxine Carr existed, but I simply wandered over to where his house was and knocked on the door. Maxine Carr answered the door, and I remember Ian Huntley kind of poked his head around into the space. I explained to Maxine Carr who I was. I explained what the press association was. And I asked if the caretaker was there, and Ian Huntley said that was him. And I asked if I could come in and just have a chat. I said, hopefully what you tell us about what you've seen might help find the children. Someone else might have seen you talking to them. It can only help. And the first
Can I ask a question? Can I ask a question while you get into this? So you walked into this house, and when you looked at the demeanour of these people, their approaches, you've been around the block a few times. Was there anything there that was ringing alarm bells, or did it just seem like a normal day?
The first strange thing was, in my experience of covering stories where children are missing, now people might hate journalists and not like journalists, that's quite common, and we don't want to talk to the press and so on. But when children are missing, in my experience, people will normally help because they understand that talking to journalists and publicity might help find them. But Huntley and Carr were a bit reluctant, and that struck me as a bit odd. They didn't want to talk to the press, and they were private people and all that kind of stuff. So I had to use a little bit of soft soap and persuasion to persuade them to let me in. And that surprised me. I mean, I'm not saying it made me think that they're the killers or anything, but it surprised me. But anyway, I persuaded them to let me in, and we sat down in the living room. And the first thing that I learned that I didn't know was that Maxine Carr had been a classroom assistant at Holly and Jessica's school. She'd worked there for a year, I think it was, and she'd left just a few weeks ago at the end of the term. So we started off, before asking Ian Huntley about what he'd seen, I was asking Maxine Carr about what she knew about the girls. The girls had made her a card on the day she left. She showed us the card. And the first strange thing that happened was that I asked Maxine Carr if at the school they'd done stranger danger, talking about don't go away with strangers. And she said, yes, they had. And I asked Maxine Carr, from her knowledge of Holly and Jessica, how did she think they'd react if, for example, a man pulled up in a car and said, get in, girls, I'll give you a lift. And the first odd thing was that Ian Huntley answered the question in a kind of emotional, upset, excitable way. And he said, well, Holly would get into the car, I think, but Jessica wouldn't. She'd put up a fight. She'd go mad. And the first thing that struck me there was, well, how could he know that? He's the caretaker of another school they don't go to. I mean, if you asked how my daughter might react to it, I might have a rough idea how my daughter might react, but Roy wouldn't have any idea. So the first thing that struck me as strange was, well, how could he know? So I then switched my attention to him and started asking him a little bit about what he thought the girls would react. And then we started to talk to him about what had happened on the Sunday when he'd seen them. And what he said was that him and Maxine had been out for a walk with their dog. I don't know if you remember, but they had an Alsatian dog. She was called Sadie. She was a great big Alsatian dog, and she had very long hair. She was quite furry. And Huntley said they'd been out for a walk in the afternoon. The dog had got in a stream or something and got wet and muddy. They'd got a bit wet and muddy. So when they got back, Maxine had gone inside to have a bath, and he'd taken the dog outside onto the sort of quadrangle, the public area outside, and he got a bucket and a hose and soap, and he got soap on the dog and hosing it and washing it and so on. And at this stage, he said Holly and Jessica had come wandering along in their Manchester United shirts as they were having their walk around the village on a Sunday afternoon. Asked him what they'd said, and he said they'd asked how Miss Carr was and had she got another job and that kind of thing. And said, what else, And he said, oh, nothing else. And I said, go through word for word what you said and they said. And he said, well, they just asked how Miss Carr was. Must have gone through it with him, I don't know, 4 or 5 times. And what struck me as odd was it's not what they'd said, it's what they hadn't said. I couldn't really believe that there were 2 10-year-old girls on earth who on a sunny August afternoon wouldn't see a man washing a big hairy dog with soap and water who wouldn't be overcome by the dog. They'd say, well, that dog's so cute, that dog. And yet they never seemed to have noticed the dog. And I didn't believe it. I didn't think that could be true. And then the next thing was I started to think that from what he'd said, there was something not right here. So I rang our photographer who wasn't there, and he came to the house. Maxine Carr posed with this card that the girls had bought her and was happy to pose. And then we said to Huntley, would you be photographed and so on? And we said it might help find the girls. And he was adamant he wouldn't be photographed. He got quite angry and aggressive and wouldn't be photographed. And he said this strange thing. He said, even my mother doesn't have a photograph of me. Well, in my experience, if people don't want to be photographed, it's because they realize that if someone sees their photograph, they'll recognize them. The woman they left behind will see them, or the man they don't know. So he wouldn't have his photograph taken. We couldn't force him to or pin him down or anything. So we left the house, and then the photographer had to go off to do something else. So I parked my car across from his house, and I had a little plastic camera, and I was thinking we've got to photograph him, photograph him because I was thinking that the police will be there to arrest him, so we'll need a photograph when he's arrested. And anyway, after sitting there for half an hour or something, a local newspaper photographer I knew got well called Helen, and she climbed into the passenger seat with a box of cheese and onion sandwiches and a flask of coffee, and said, "Can I come and sit and eat my lunch with you?" And I said, "You sure can. You can give me a sandwich and get your camera out, and if anybody comes out of that house, you photograph them." And Huntley came out, and that's the photograph of him, the famous photograph of him sitting in the car, and in the window behind is the local newspaper's picture. And I think that was the only picture taken. And one interesting thing about the photograph is that Huntley was arrested the following week. So we published the photograph the following week to say, this is the man who's been arrested. And it wasn't none of the photographers who looked at it thought it was a particularly good photograph. But I've got 2 brothers, as Roy said. One used to play for Stoke, but the other one was quite a senior detective, and he'd not long retired. And he rang me up when he saw the photograph in the newspapers and said, "What a fascinating photograph. I think you've got the right man, Brian." What he'd seen in the photograph was not Huntley. He'd seen the tyres on the car. He noticed that you could see 3 tyres on Huntley's old car, and all 3 of those tyres were brand new. And his question was, why has a caretaker got 3 new tyres on an old car? He's probably got 4 new tyres on an old car. He's got 4 new tyres on an old car because the tyres he had on Sunday are covered in mud from where he deposited the bodies. And that was true. The picture played a part in the trial. I rang the police. Well, my brother told me to ring the police and ask if they were checking tyre places. They were indeed. Later that day, they found the old tyres at a tyre place. And that was it, really. I'm not sure that I did anything particularly unusual. I think that if I did anything well when I was interviewing him, I think it wasn't that I asked questions. I think it was that I listened. I've always been of the view, and I've always been trained that when you interview someone, the most important thing is not the questions you ask. It's the way you listen to their answers. Oddly, one of the most difficult things I've always found, and this will sound silly because I've been a journalist forever, but one of the most difficult things I've always found to do is to ask someone questions and take a note, because it's very hard to listen to what they're saying while you're writing down a note. So I've always developed a technique of not taking a note, of listening to what they're saying. And then if they say something interesting, then in Columbo kind of style, to say, oh, do you just mind if I take a note of that so I can remember? And it's very hard. But if you don't listen, you're not giving yourself time to evaluate what you've said. So it might have been that when Ian Huntley said, you know, Holly would have reacted like that and Jessica like that, I could have just written it down and gone and reported it. But I think the key to it was listening to it and thinking about it made me realize that, well, what he'd said couldn't possibly be right, could it? Because he couldn't, it's simply impossible for him to know how they would have reacted. It's impossible. And likewise with the dog, I could have simply written down that that's what they'd said. But it didn't. It's just not right, is it? No girls would react like that. So I think, if anything, the key is listening. I was always taught, and I was on a weekly paper, that when journalists ask questions, they're not guard dogs. We don't snap at people and pin them down. What we are sheepdogs. We want to guide our interviewee from one corner of a field to the other corner of a field. We don't mind if they ramble on the way. We don't mind if they start telling us about what their neighbour did or where their wife went yesterday, because when they ramble, sometimes they tell you little gems of information that you couldn't possibly know to ask. So all you do is if they start talking too much about what their wife did at the gym, you just gently nudge them back. But you must always let them ramble and let them listen and evaluate and think about what they say. So I think if I did anything well, it's probably that I listened to what Ian Huntley said and had a good think about it. The great irony is that Maxine Carr didn't say anything to me that seemed unlikely. She described how they'd had Sunday lunch and gone for a walk. Of course, the truth was that Maxine Carr wasn't even in the house. Every word she said was a lie. She wasn't even there on that Sunday. She was in Lincolnshire at a party or something. Well, but it was only what Huntley said that made me think that, well, I don't think he's telling the truth. And then it made me think, well, if he's not telling the truth, she must know he's not telling the truth. So I'm not sure that he's telling the truth. And in terms of what I did with the information, I obviously wrote stories about, we went and wrote a story about what Maxine Carr had said and what Huntley had said. But after we'd done that and after we got a photograph, I rang my brother, my policeman brother, told him what Huntley had said, told him how I thought it was so strange what he'd said. And my brother, who had been retired, my brother was a chief superintendent. He was a detective for most of his time in Cheshire. And he said I simply had to ring Cambridgeshire Police straight away and let them know. He said if he'd been there, there would have been grounds for arrest, because Huntley appeared to be the last man to see them, and clearly what he was saying. So that's why I rang the police on his advice. I don't normally go around ringing the police, but so I rang the police and told them what I'd said, and then I gave evidence at the trial, and now I'm a character in a drama, rather amusingly. I'd rather be on television batting for England, really. But
well, you was able to bat well. I do remember that. So when you was sort of getting this feedback and you was coming to the conclusion that Ian was lying, Ian Huntley was lying. What was going on? I mean, how was you? I mean, was you nervous? Was you? I mean, how did you feel when you knew something was lying? You must have been thinking, this person in front of me very probably murdered 2 little girls. I mean, what was your instinct?
Excuse me. No, I wasn't thinking like that. I'm a reporter, so the first thought is when we're covering stories about missing children or missing people. The first thought is that what we want to have are photographs of people who are arrested. So my first thought wasn't anything like that. I know most people would think it would be like that, but I'm a reporter, and every day all I do are sad things. I do horrible things all the time. The sort of horror the viewer would see, journalists when they're working don't see. You're concentrating on the work in front of you. So my first thought as he was saying it, I wasn't thinking I've caught the killer or anything like that. I was thinking that he must be a suspect. There's a chance he's going to be arrested. We need to make sure I've got a proper note of everything he said. And we need to make sure we've got a photograph of him, because if he's arrested, no one else will have a photograph of him. We need to make sure. So that was what was in my mind. That's I know it sounds strange because you watch these things on television and it's horrifying. And when I watch it on television, it's horrifying too. But when you're working, you're just concentrating on one thing at a time, one step at a time. You've got to be there. You haven't got time really to sit back and think. And I've covered some horrific things, Hillsborough and things like that. But you're not sitting there looking at it in a big picture. You're sitting one step at a time, just trying to do your job. Because if journalists do their job professionally, one step at a time, then in the long run, everyone should benefit. You haven't really got time to be sitting there thinking, well, my goodness, this might be a murderer. You can't. I met lots of murderers and so on. I mean, since it's happened, and sometimes in the still of the night when I think about it, I think what he said about how Holly and Jessica would react was probably exactly how Holly and Jessica did react. He probably at that moment was telling the truth. And that when they came into the house and whatever he did, that's exactly what happened. And it happened in that house while I was there. But I've thought about that since. But at the time, I wasn't thinking like that. I was just really thinking we need to make sure we've got a photograph of him. And I need to make sure I get out of him as much information as I can. I get it written down because at some point it'll be useful. I mean, obviously, then we weren't writing stories saying that he's a suspect or he's done it. It was we didn't. You can't write anything like that. It was just a matter of waiting until he was arrested, sort of thing. I did. It took about a week for them to arrest him. Yeah. There you go. The other odd thing about Huntley, which I don't know if you read about, that so that happened at about, I interviewed him at about 11:30, 12 o'clock, midday on the Thursday after they disappeared, which would have been the 8th. So the other strange thing that happened was that at about 6 o'clock on that day, on Thursday the 8th, the local BBC were doing one of those live interviews outside the school, where they have a reporter standing outside saying, like the day's today sort of thing. And the reporter was standing out there with one of the producers, and the cameraman was all set up outside. And a few people were standing watching the excitement of watching BBC look at the footage. And there was a BBC producer there called Debbie Tubby, who's a mate of mine. She still works at the BBC. And they were waiting for a call from the newsroom to say the 6 o'clock news had finished. We're on, it's 6:30. It was about 6:25. And her phone rang. And it was some mundane call. It was her mother ringing to say that, she'd washed her blouse and turned it pink or something mundane. And she said into the phone, "Really?" Like that. And Ian Huntley was standing watching the filming and standing near her. And when she put her phone down or put her phone in her pocket, he said to her, "Have they found the girl's clothes?" And she looked at him and said, "Who are you?" And he said, "Oh, I'm Ian Huntley, the caretaker." And she said, "What did you just say? Have they found the girl's clothes?" He said, "Yeah, they found the girl's clothes." Now, she then rang the police and said, "This is very strange. This man called Ian Huntley was standing next to me and he heard me say 'really' in the phone. And he's just asked me if they found the girl's clothes." Well, how does he know the girls haven't got their clothes on them? How does he know the girls' clothes have become separated from them? So oddly, on the same day, 2 journalists rang the police to say that Huntley was saying strange things, which I've never come across before. And I didn't know she'd rung the police at that. I'd found out a day or 2 later, and she didn't know I had.
Yeah, to say it's. I think it's interesting. Yeah, I think it's interesting that I mean, you're always about being present in the time, and this is really interesting. I'd like to just move on a little bit. I mean, Huntley gets arrested, gets taken away, and didn't you spend some time in the courtroom or the sort of hanging around the Old Bailey at the time?
Well, interestingly, I couldn't cover the trial because I was a witness. I was a prosecution witness. I was giving evidence, so I obviously couldn't. It was a funny question. My daughter asked me why wasn't I covering the trial, and she was 9, I think, at the time. I had to explain to her that Witnesses can't sit listening to all the evidence, then go and give their evidence because they'll be affected by the evidence. So I've never done that before or since. I've never given evidence in a trial, but I gave evidence at number 1 court of the Old Bailey with all my mates in the mass ranks of the press, photographing me outside and watching me. So I've obviously covered lots of trials and been in lots of courtrooms and things, but I've never experienced as a witness before. That was a very strange experience, being asked questions by barristers. That's another interesting kind of questioning, because when barristers are asking you questions, for all you think to say, well, just tell the truth and just answer the question, something in your head, first of all, makes you think you've done something wrong because you're standing in the witness box. And secondly, you can't help but thinking, well, why are they asking that question? It was very strange. And I went through the reporter's nightmare. A reporter's nightmare for any trainee reporter is that you'll be asked to read your shorthand in a courtroom. Because I write Pitman's shorthand. And that nightmare happened to me. My notebook had been taken off me by the police when Huntley was arrested after I was interviewed. I hadn't seen it for a year, and it was handed to me by an usher at number 1 court of the Old Bailey, and I was told to read out all my shorthand that I hadn't read for a year. That was an interesting experience too. But that was interesting being questioned about it too, because barristers questioning is another kind of questioning. Barristers tend to only ask questions where they know the answer. Journalists never know the answer. Journalists are always starting off on a blank page. You never know what the answer is. So that's a different kind of questioning altogether, you know. Yeah.
That's absolutely fascinating. We've got a few comments here, and I mean, we've got Tamsin. This came a while ago, but Tamsin is a reporter. I know she's there. She remembers the thing vividly. We've got Danny. Danny's just said something here. Great listening from Brian. Media session that had a message for the abductor, which had been left as a voicemail on one of the girls' phones, which was switched off. Huntley turned it on. That helped to triangulate, and we've lost. Just see what's
Media session.
Helped to triangulate.
No, that's actually not. That's almost right. So that was what one of the funny things about covering these kind of cases is that it's like soldiers in wars. That if you ask me what's my first memory of it, even though it's horrific and it's not funny, your first memory of it when you're a journalist is always something funny that made you laugh. There always is. And so what that message is referring to is that obviously the girls were wearing David Beckham number 7 shirts when they disappeared. And Beckham was an iconic figure, and almost every kid in England had a Manchester United shirt with David Beckham on. And Manchester, it was August, it was pre-season. Manchester United were on tour in China. And on the Tuesday or something or Wednesday after the girls had disappeared, Manchester United issued a statement saying, please help find the girls. And Beckham issued a statement saying, do all you can to help the girls. And on the Friday, the day after I'd interviewed Huntley, a battery of Cambridgeshire Police press officers started ringing up journalists at about 3:00 in the afternoon, saying, can you get to Cambridgeshire Police headquarters, which was about 45 minutes away from Soham, for, I think, 5:00. The detective leading the investigation is going to make a direct appeal to the abductor. Obviously, the girls' bodies hadn't been found then. They were just missing. Now, I knew then, and all journalists knew then, that he wasn't making a direct appeal to the abductor. What he was trying to do, Holly's phone was missing. He was trying to persuade whoever got them to turn on Holly's phone. And if they turned on Holly's phone, that would enable techies to triangulate where the phone was. It's a common trick that the police use. And the message was going to be, speak to me man to man, and I'll leave you a text on Holly's phone. So you ring me back, So anyway, it so happened that the detective leading the investigation at that stage was Detective Chief Inspector David Beck, B-E-C-K. And somehow, I don't know how, the press officer designated to ring Sky and Radio 5 to tell them to go to him, somehow told them that David Beckham was going to be making an appeal, and it triggered panic in all the media, where I was getting calls from the news desk saying, Sky have just written this flash saying David Beckham, the most famous man in England, is going to make an appeal to the abductor. And it led to lots of comical, laughing conversations between me and news editors, other reporters and news editors, saying, no, not David Beckham. Detective Chief Inspector David Beck. David Beckham's in China. The police wouldn't ask a footballer to make a direct appeal to the abductor, was it? But the phones did play a part in finding them. So the reason for Huntley's arrest was that a techie, I don't know a better word for it, was trying to work out where Jessica's phone had been when it disappeared off the network. And on the Thursday morning, the week after I interviewed him, the day Huntley was arrested, the evidence showed that Holly's phone had disappeared off the network right outside Huntley's house. And that's, I've seen previews of this drama on Channel 5 next week. That's one of the threads in the drama, the techie trying to work out where the phone was. So it isn't quite right that the abductor actually switched it on, but it was traced, and that was the trigger for his arrest. The phone disappeared right outside his front door. That was the trigger for his arrest.
Yeah, Danny was saying we couldn't all see this on here, but we can see here that Huntley turned it on, or helped triangulate the position of the phone. Yeah, it's
they've never actually found it. They never found the phone. Nobody knows. He presumably threw it away. So.
Oh dear me. So I mean, yeah, this is 20 years ago. And so we've got this new drama on Channel 5 coming through, which a character plays you. Well, that's a bit weird, isn't it? Someone playing you. Was he better looking than you when at that age, or?
Not to be, I think. What I'm really excited about, he's got hair. That was really exciting. Yeah. It's called Steve Hedge. I had quite a long Zoom call with him where he was apparently studying my facial features. It's been really interesting, actually. A bit weird being played by an actor. My daughter's in it too. It's a bit weird, but it's been very interesting learning how they do things.
Being played by an actor. Wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
So when people now tell me to be myself, I say which one, So.
Yeah, it's. I'm just let me just put it the details on the bottom. We've got a few minutes. If you've got a few minutes, I've got a few minutes. I'd really like to know. I mean, as a reporter, and again, you've talked about the powers of listening. You've interviewed a lot of interesting people. I mean, you live not too far away from Sandringham.
I used to then, yeah. I've done lots of jobs with the Queen and so on. But when you were talking about listening, what was in my head were two stories I remember, one good and one bad about listening. So I'll tell you the bad one first, should I?
No, please.
So one of the things I've always been wary of is when you go to interview someone, is that it's not a good idea to write down the questions, because if all you do is have ideas in your head and think, I'll write down these questions, you might not ask the question that reveals the really interesting bit of information. That the trick is to just have a chat and listen and be confident enough to let them wander and chat and listen. So I used to be, in the late 80s, early 90s, a football reporter at the Press Association when Ken Bates was chairman of Chelsea, the notorious Ken Bates. And he didn't like talking to the press. And one of my colleagues in the football reporter at the Press Association managed to persuade him to do an interview. And he said, come along to Stamford Bridge and you can interview me. And the reporter was reasonably young and he was very nervous because Ken Bates had a bit of a fearsome reputation. So he decided what he'd do is he'd write down two sets of questions on two separate pieces of paper. On one set, he wrote some nice, easy dolly questions, like how great are you, Ken, and that kind of thing. And on the other set, he wrote some really difficult ones, about this is outrageous, this fencing people in, and Chelsea's a terrible club, and that kind of thing. And his logic was that he'd start asking the easy questions, and then if the interview went well, he'd switch to the difficult ones. So Ken Bates invited him into his office, Ken Bates sat on one side of the desk, and Kevin, my mate, sat on the other. And Kevin put his 2 sheets of paper in front of him on the desk and started asking his dolly questions. And it went well. Ken was lovely and chatting away. And Ken stops and says, "Oh, I wouldn't mind a drink. Do you fancy a drink, Kevin?" And Kevin said, "Yeah, it'd be great." And Ken says, "What, whiskey?" I said, "Oh, yeah, it'd be lovely, yeah." And Ken says, "Just sit still. The whiskey's in the cabinet just behind you. I'll just need to get behind your chair to get the whiskey out." So Ken goes to get the whiskey out. And as he's getting it out, he turns round and he's now behind Kevin, looking over his shoulder. He looks down and reads all Kevin's questions and reads all his nasty ones and said, "Were you going to ask me those questions, you cheeky bastard? Get out." So that's not a good way to do it. But one of the great pieces of journalism I've ever seen was by a reporter you've probably never heard of. He was the Press Association's defence correspondent, and he was called Charlie Miller. And in 1997, he won the Scoop of the Year. Do you know what he might have won the Scoop of the Year for? And know what happened in 1997?
I don't know. Was he at the Stoke match where they actually won? Or
who died in 1997? Princess Diana.
Oh, yes.
The biggest scoop in PA's history was that we revealed that Princess Diana had died. So what happened was that news of the car crash in Paris came through. It was on a Saturday, wasn't it? It came through Saturday evening that Diana's car had crashed in Paris and that she was injured. But there was then, the palace said nothing. No one else said anything. All they knew for some time was that she was injured. Charlie Miller was our defence correspondent, and he happened to be travelling on that Saturday night. I can't remember where it was, somewhere in the Middle East. He was going on a bit of a junket with Robin Cook, who was the Foreign Secretary. Robin Cook was going on some trade mission or something somewhere in the Middle East, and he was taking with him the Press Association's defence reporter and Reuters' defence reporter. And so they landed wherever they landed in the what would have been sort of midnight-ish, early hours of Saturday morning British time. Charlie and various government alicadoos and so on around Robin Cook walked off the plane into the airport along with the Reuters reporter. And Robin Cook was met by the British envoy or someone from the British embassy in the airport. He was walking through. And this guy took Robin Cook on one side, and Charlie Miller, our reporter, watched what was happening, and he saw Robin Cook's face go white as a sheet, and stood in shock. And Charlie Miller thought, they all knew. They knew that Diana was injured. They didn't know. They knew that there'd been a car crash. Charlie Miller thought, what could possibly make the Foreign Secretary, Robin Cook, go white as a sheet like that? Could it be that someone from the Foreign Office has just passed on the message from Downing Street that Princess Diana is dead? So he took a press officer or some kind of official who he knew on one side and said, "If I report that Robin Cook's just been told that Princess Diana is dead, would I be wrong?" And this guy said, "That's very observant of you. No, you wouldn't be wrong." And we reported it, and he was right. The Reuters reporter who was with him didn't look at Robin Cook. He didn't watch or think. He didn't report it at all. And that's another skill that journalists has to have. It's the same kind of skill that I was trying to talk about with Huntley. You look and think and wonder, why would Robin Cook, a seasoned politician, go white as a sheet being spoken to? What could it be? That's an example of bad practice and good practice. And it boils down to listening, observing, and having a think and trying to put two and two together.
I know when we met a few weeks ago, we were sitting in my local boozer. Shout out to the Roaring Meg, and you said something really interesting, which was whatever people say, you think in terms of can that possibly be so?
Oh, that's right. The obvious example was if I'm interviewing you now and you tell me confidently you're Father Christmas, well, you're not, are you? So you're lying. But it happens all the time. The instinct is to think that we're all nice and we all tell the truth and whatever. But the truth is we're not, and people have lots of reasons to lie, and not only just lie, but they have lots of reasons to tell you your version of the truth. Roy mentioned my brother, who used to play for Stoke. Now, if someone wrote that my brother was the worst goalkeeper in the world, he'd say that's outrageous. Those lying press, they know nothing. And he wasn't the worst goalkeeper in the world. But if someone said he was the best goalkeeper in the world, they'd say the press are brilliant. He wasn't the best goalkeeper in the world either. And every description he ever gives of anything that went wrong, it's always from his point of view. The striker would tell you a different point of view. The manager would tell you the different point of view. He's not necessarily lying. He's just telling it you to make you think good of him. And that's the truth. So if he says that, it was the greatest save you've ever seen, you have to think, well, really? Was it, sort of thing? That's what I meant by it. You've got to evaluate and just think that people don't tell you the truth. And PR girls in publicity are always, oh, you're lovely and marvellous, Brian. No, I'm not. That's ridiculous. You're only talking to me like that because you want something, aren't you? That's a good example with journalists. You're always surrounded by, women in PR who are telling you you're marvellous. You're not. You have to evaluate it and take it all in your stride, don't you? That's what I meant to be. It's about, I think, listening, observing, and thinking, and not panicking and writing everything down in a panic. It's about thinking and just thinking, well, why has he said that? And why did he look like that? And putting two and two together in your mind and thinking, well, could it be like that? And then possibly asking a question based on what you've thought to see if you can nudge it in the right direction. That's always been my view of it. You're not just a note-taking, writing down machine. You've got to think about what people say and wonder how they say.
I'm loving this. Have you got a couple of minutes? You mentioned some of the people that you've interviewed in the past. A couple of people want to talk to you. You've interviewed Robert Maxwell in the past.
I have. Yeah, I did. Yeah, Robert Maxwell. He must
have been a pleasure.
Yeah, no, he was interesting. Robert Maxwell, it was interesting. He was a bit like Bobby Robson, the football manager. I interviewed him lots of times. So the way to get Robert Maxwell talking was to. I always got the impression that Robert Maxwell was surrounded by sycophants all the time who were a bit scared of him, but he was very confrontational. So the way to get him talking and the way to get good things out of him was to confront him, to say, absolute rubbish. He liked to debate, and that was the way to do it. Normally, you're gentle and you listen, but sometimes with people, it's a good idea to confront them and wind them up. And Robert Maxwell was a good example of that. I remember once he gave a press conference and he was getting very wound up and someone asked him a question. He stormed off out of the press conference. He left. We're all sitting there thinking, where's he gone? And then 10 minutes later, he came back in and said, hang on, I've thought about that. What you're talking about, and that's utter crap. I've just thought about that. He was feisty. And Bobby Robson was interesting. The impression always given of Bobby Robson that he's very avuncular and gentle, but he wasn't. The way to get Bobby Robson saying things, he had a very short fuse and he could lose his temper. But when he lost his temper, then he said really interesting things. So if you watch lots of press conferences and ask questions where he loses his temper and you might think, oh, that's terrible. But it was generally being done deliberately because everybody knew that if you could make him lose his temper, then he started spewing out quotes and said, I'll tell you why I haven't picked Nigel Clough. You listen to this. And you've got to... I think the truth is you've got to, not everybody's the same. I'm not Roy and Roy's not me and I'm not my brother and I'm not my wife. Everybody's different. And journalists have got to try as best they can to gauge what's the best way to engage someone in conversation and put them at their ease and to get what you want. It might be different, the hardest question always in journalism was always said to be to persuade a woman to tell you her age. So it may be that if you're interviewing a woman, maybe that the answer is to start off with jokes about your age and make her laugh about her age and your age. There might be all sorts of different ways to do it, but your job is to try and evaluate what people are and try to be what you think they want you to be and try to gauge them. You can't just go in and say there's one way to interview, there's one way to ask questions, and this is the way. It isn't like that. You've got to go in with an open mind and open ears and listen to what people say, and your questions have got to be a response to what people say. And I always think, I know it sounds a bit silly, but I always think Columbo's a good example. He's obviously a scripted character, but Columbo isn't Arthur. He's a very clever interviewer. That idea of asking a question when nobody's thinking, it's quite a clever thing where he's losing bits of paper. A trick I often use if someone's been difficult is to pretend I haven't bought a notebook, and I say, I'll take a note. Oh, I haven't got a notebook. Have you got a scrap of paper or a pen? And that distracts people and says, what sort of journalist are you? You haven't got a notebook. And you say, sorry, I'm an idiot, sort of thing, you know. And anything like that to distract them, to relax them a bit, to make it. And oddly, I think Columbo is a good example. You watch Columbo, whoever wrote that, the script, knows how to interview people and to put people at ease. It's obviously scripted and fake, but Columbo's a good example. All that distraction he does with his pockets and his Mac and things like that. It's clever stuff.
Yeah, a lot of the younger people listening to this won't have a clue who Columbo
is. All right. Other people younger than us now. All right, I didn't know.
Yeah, there are people younger than us. Yeah, it was great. Now, just before we finish, and I've kept a lot longer, kept it longer than I intended. You've interviewed our king.
Yeah, I have interviewed Prince Charles. Yeah. I've covered lots of jobs with the royals. So when I was the PA's Eastern Counties reporter, you always had to work on Christmas Day, because the only news story on Christmas Day is that the royals all go to church at Sandringham. So Christmas Day always was my wife and daughter was going to Sandringham, and we always ate Christmas dinner at 5 o'clock when I got back. Sandringham was about an hour and a half from where I used to live, near Cambridge. So it's interviewing the royals is very strange, or covering the royals. There's a sort of protocol that you're not supposed to ask a member of the royal family a question. But you can ask if they speak to someone, if they're on a visit. So if they come on a visit and Charles or Camilla or whatever speaks to Roy, it is okay for me to then go and ask Roy what Charles or Camilla have said, but you're not supposed to ask them a question. It's the most, I hate it. It's the most silly thing. So some cynical journalists, what they might do, if they particularly wanted to ask Roy a question. So, for example, I remember once it was not on the 7/7 bombings in 2005, but there was a second attempt, wasn't there, on the 21st, I think it was, which the police foiled. There was a second attempt at bombing London on the 21st. And I remember that Charles and Camilla, on the day after that, the 22nd, I think it was the 22nd of July 2005, came on this peculiar trip to Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk, where the square of Bury St Edmunds had been cleared, and they'd laid out all these little wooden stalls for them to visit, and all these people were there to shaking hands. And I asked the press officer there if it might be possible if I could ask Charles a question at some convenient moment along the lines of, I'm sure it's great being in Bury St Edmunds, Your Majesty, but I imagine your hearts and minds are with the people of London getting on the tubes today, and that's where you are really. And the press office were adamant that we couldn't do that because it was a breach of protocol. So one of us, it might have been me, approached a few people in the crowd who I thought he was likely to target and asked if they'd asked that question. So we got those quotes from Prince Charles, but we had to get them via a thing. But I have on a couple of occasions interviewed him. So when Princess Margaret died, he agreed to do a little chat about Princess Margaret. So I remember driving off to Sandringham one Saturday afternoon to sit and chat to him about Princess Margaret. And the other occasion was, I remember what it was. I was covering a job at Sandringham where he was handing medals to soldiers one day while they were staying at Sandringham. And there was a mining disaster in New Zealand that morning. And I asked the press officer if it's possible that if we could speak to him about the mining disaster in New Zealand. And he said he would. So it was quite fun. I was sent off to wait in a drawing room at Sandringham. And I stood there waiting for a while, and eventually he turned up and we went out into the garden. He was photographed and we interviewed him in the garden, and I didn't steal I didn't steal anything from the drawing room for a souvenir and so on. So it was quite interesting. But the royals are strange. It's very that's why that you don't see them interviewed very often. But Christmas Day at Sandringham, we did that for I think 18 years. I think since I don't do that anymore, Christmas Day is very strange when I don't go to Sandringham. My daughter one day when she must have been about 5. Our next door neighbours used to have a little dog called Freckles, and it was we used to go early in the morning, so it was early in the morning, and she was getting in the car, and the woman next door came walking past. She'd taken Freckles for his early morning walk, and Freckles had got some, because it was Christmas Day, he got some tinsel on his head or something, and our next door neighbour said to Millie, "Oh, where are you going?" And Millie said, "Oh, I'm going to Sandringham to see the Queen." And our next door neighbour said to the dog, "Oh, how exciting that is, isn't it, Freckles?" And she'd going to Sandringham to see the Queen. So Millie said, "Oh, Freckles can come too." So the next thing was Freckles is in the car coming to Sandringham with us. So Millie took him and stood in the line. The royals sort of walked from Sandringham House down to the church. And the Duke of Edinburgh spotted the dog and made a beeline for us and had this long chat with Millie about the dog. And Millie was explaining it was Freckles and he was patting the dog. And she's got this great story of how she talked to the Duke of Edinburgh because he was fixated by Freckles the dog.
And people are they all love a good dog. We've gone on a long time. Let me just put on this thing where someone's playing you. It's called Maxine, and someone's playing a boy from Biddulph. I've got to ask, where the hell's your Biddulph accent, by the way? You didn't used to speak this posh when you was at home.
I lost it. It's funny, whenever I come back, I always start talking and calling everybody duck and how are you and things. It's funny, but when I'm down here, I've lost it. I don't think I've lost it all. I still say duck quite a lot, but it's funny. I've lived in so many places. I think I've lost it.
I could, as he's standing there in the Meg talking to this young lady behind the bar about lobby and oatcakes. You can take the Stokey out of Stoke, but anyway, so someone's playing Brian from Biddulph in Maxine. Steve Edge, there you go.
On Molly McCann.
What else has he done? Steve Edge?
Well, I have never seen it. He's in Benidorm, and he was in the Peep Show. When I saw him, I did recognise him. He was, I think, Benidorm. He was quite well known. He's reasonably well known.
Yeah. Great. So the guy from Benidorm's playing you. Will he speak? Because it was 20 years ago. Will he speak with a Biddulph accent, or will he be speaking like you?
He comes from Staffordshire. He comes from Cannock, I think. So he has got a bit of a sort of Staffordshire. It's not quite North Staffordshire, but he has. We did have quite a long conversation, actually. I had quite a long Zoom call with him about accents, and I was doing, Koskikabo again a Woduck and that kind of thing. And he'd not heard all that before, but his accent is not. I didn't think I've seen it. I didn't think it was a million miles off. Yeah, no, I thought it's very interesting. Yeah, the joke was when we were talking to the producers, when they told me that they got to a point sometime where they were casting. They said, "Have you got any ideas who'd like to play you?" And I said, "Well, funnily enough, I happen to know that me and George Clooney were born in the same week. His birth, I just had, for some reason, I know this. I was born on the 3rd of May, 1961, and George Clooney was born on the 6th of May, 1961. And this producer said, "Oh, right, that sounds promising." She said, "Hang on a minute. So you're born on the 3rd, and he was born on the 6th." And I said, "Yeah." She said, "Oh, damn, he's too young." She said, "But don't worry, I'll phone him personally and tell him, look, I'm really sorry. We've had to reject you because you're 3 days too young to play Brian." So whether she ever did that or not.
Oh, fantastic. And before you go, what do you have on your oatcakes, mate?
What do I like? Well, personally, I like bacon and cheese, but I actually got some for I've got a mate who's a barrister who comes from Wales. And she bought me some Welsh cakes, and I gave her some oat cakes. And she was telling me that, first of all, she liked pikelets better than oat cakes, which I couldn't take that in. But also, what she enjoyed was butter and strawberry jam on oat cakes, which it's not for me, that really. Hot oat cakes and bacon and cheese, I think.
Yeah, I did make the mistake of taking some oat cakes to Helsinki, and they put jam on it. Couldn't believe it. I never took oat cakes again. It just felt so wrong.
It's the only thing my wife likes about Stoke. She can't stand my family. She can't stand Stoke, but she'll do anything for an oatcake if you ever meet her.
Oh, that's harsh. That's harsh. It's like that. It's like that football player's wife I saw on the news today. She didn't like Manchester. She couldn't get proper food in Manchester. Now, I've been in Manchester. I've never starved. But there again, I wouldn't starve anywhere in the world. So, hey, Brian, it's been really great. We've done a lot longer than I anticipate. And I'm going to end the stream now. So we've got this thing for Maxine. Someone's playing Brian. Biddulph boy done good. Fascinating story. Thank you very much for sharing it with us. You've got to come on again. We've got to talk. We've just got to talk about listening strategies because this is really interesting to me. Take care, Brian. I'm going to end the stream now. Don't go. We haven't finished, but I'm going to end the stream for everyone else. Thank you for watching for 55 minutes. Good God, that's gone quick. Take care. Wait, bye-bye, Brian.
Bye-bye. Nice to see you.